Americans coming in for a couple of days setting up a bush clinic. And it says, well, what's the pay for something that's less quality when you could get it for free from someone who's hip? And this is a big problem. Do you think that by perpetuating development the way that we have been, that we're making this dependency continue because they think that they're getting better products, better materials, and better aid?
That's really great.
That's basically
Well, makes sense. Makes sense.
do you agree? Because if you agree, that means cut all of that. Take it out and let them show themselves that their work is just as good as anyone else's. But if you disagree, what would you tell them?
I don't know if you can extrapolate from one project. There's different types of development assistance and different impacts. There's direct budget support, for example, which goes into government treasuries. So that's a different type of assistance, a different modality. So direct budget assistance. So I don't know if you can
It's a cultural question. People think that things that are being put in by Western, the Chinese, are better quality than things that are being built by locals. Fair to say? Because that's what belief.
Again, I don't know if you can generalize that, you know.
Because that was the thing that I kept coming up with. I mean, it's me. By local.
Yeah, I mean, I think aid is kind of I'm saying if you want to think about the outcome of the climate change panel or push doesn't useful.
How do you get people to trust their own
just the progress?
rather than having a need?
Again, I think people in different countries, project doesn't necessarily tell you the whole kind of story.
It's a really good lens as well.
Yeah, okay,
have ways of making even things that didn't happen within these decades. So I'm very kind of simple about psychiatric events.
Oh, thank you very much. All right.
No, I really, my question actually came from what you said, because I think twisted a bit to sound like it comes from. So just keep talking about it, and also if we do something similar to what you have, that would be great because it really kind of fits in with like our team of trying to say, okay, how do you, because sometimes I feel like great, this might be wrong, that might be wrong, but let it come from us. Let us make our own mistakes. You know what I mean? Because if we don't make our own mistakes, it's always, it's easy to just blame them and try to use that customize your own versions. If we let's, even if I don't even mind us having it from like our own style, but let it be our own. You know what I mean? Because even this idea of inherently despotic leaders, they're not inherently despotic. There's a framework in place that allows them to be so. And when you have money flowing in from outside, it helps them because then they have if people stop paying taxes, they don't care. If there's a war, they don't care because it doesn't stop the money flowing. What stops the money flowing? Like, you just need it to Nigeria. If the rebels decide to then that's an issue. But if Nigerians stop paying taxes, the government don't care because only a very small percentage of their revenue taxes. So that's it's the restructuring of accountability from.
If you're doing it,
I know a lot of journalists go and they all they should go embedded with Amazon or I'm not sure recent NGOs go, I'm not sure how they arrange this. They might arrange their own security.
But anyway, so
No.
But yeah, we're looking forward to having
Yeah, can't wait.
Yeah,
Not-
definitely
not-
quite good, but I couldn't.
Where's the s-
Eric. I'm just not Eric.
Okay.
Yeah, she's done now. Never mind.
It's just into the
You guys pick up a pet over there.
the question.
Sorry, what was the
No,
question?
Basically, it's just it comes off of shocking revelation.
It's awesome. No, it's just like kind of fun. I don't really think
Would you rather have a full-time Kenyan doctor in your village who doesn't have access
a
to
pen.
internet?
Oh, this one.
Or would you rather have
Yeah,
a
that's
six
it.
doctors
Oh,
going
yeah.
from America
Oh, I know, it's not
on
your head just now.
mission trip
No.
for 3 days and do a first class.
Oh,
I'm
no,
trying to get
I
moving.
hope I didn't cut off your question.
And
I was like, you know, I feel like that was a start point to respond.
No, I completely understand. That's something
When
we're
we can have
discussing.
skilled people coming in and
Decision
doing
making.
stuff.
But I think
And extremely again, when I was doing
Right.
guiding Ruby,
think
it's
aid is gonna
3 months of the year.
Right.
when I was going to school,
Yeah.
get rid of teachers and bring in
some sort of
students to
Yeah.
plan, you know, what to do. He always thought, no,
Right.
they're all rich, they always money, they're wrong.
So what is domestic
So
resource
does this
mobilization? That just means
perpetuation
like,
of the fact that
So
us
this is
know that they're
saving
trying to know what
our
we're doing,
sort of
it's why we bring
taxes.
them in.
mm,
We can and you said yourself, we need it now, we need it now. We can't wait. Should we not be waiting? At least think that we can make savings. That's basically.
yeah,
And also being very good at collecting taxes and
Yeah.
also collecting rents
Yeah.
from farmers.
So
Yeah.
it's not
They
really
have
work.
set up
Okay, so
but then they collected.
could you rephrase it in
So yeah, so basically the question is
yeah,
there any hope
You know,
that
education.
yeah,
Kenyans and Africans in general will feel that the work that they can create is just as good. The hospitals that they build, the schools, the roads are just as
Yeah.
good as the ones being put in by development work.
yeah,
As long as those things are coming in for
Yeah.
cheap and they're coming in with these big machines
Yeah.
and big factories and people flowing in like it's a big mission. Is there any
Yeah,
hope
Trump gets
that
elected,
Africa will
it's
take
like, yeah.
ownership of Africa as long as development exists?
Well, I think that would begin with
Yeah.
with
Well,
results.
so
If
one of the
there have been
questions that they
small
asked is
scale
like, if China can be
projects
an
that have
alternative model,
that have started,
and it
that
is
have
like
worked through
more
a
not so much Chinese model,
proper,
but an East
visible
Asian kind of developmental state model,
plan
which Korea is a good
and had
example.
results. I
China
think
and
if
Japan,
people begin
like,
to see
African
tangible
countries
results,
also are
then
very like
they begin
heavy
to respond.
government-led,
But
you know,
I have seen cases,
heavy on top,
and
but
it's not
they
just
don't
in
seem
terms
to
of
be that
professional
as capable of like implementing those kinds of
sectors, but also
policies.
even in
I don't know
politics,
why
where
that
you've
is.
got politicians
And so it's kind of like, yeah, maybe somebody like
But
Obama
he's
is great.
just
Just
in
like
terms of
centralize that power
setting
and
out
then do it.
things and doing the development that people want to see, but just because he doesn't play the politics game, he gets voted out. And so it's about yes, all people being able to market what it is they're doing. Because I think for a lot of people, particularly if you look at the underdeveloped areas where there's poor education, where there's literacy, you're not just doing something, you have to tell people what it is you're doing and why you're doing it. That's why you see a lot of projects in certain parts of Africa which will be, it's not just
Yeah.
well or ball. It has to have a sign next to it saying, this is a ball brought by so-and-so. Because you need to get that message across to people and say, well, I've been an MP for 4 years, and in 4 years I've done one thing. And the people don't get the irony that in 4 years you should be able to do so many more things, but because you've packaged that little you've done, they see you as a hero. So, I think
Actually, you know what? This relates exactly to what happened in the village, where they had different stations, and people were going from station to station, and they were going from station to station. I thought that was worth inaugurated too many stations, giving them time.
14,
1% of people doing the job of these 6.
Today,
Why is that? Why do you have these stations? It makes them and also, it helps to get more people to come over so that you can pay for the trip. So they're doing it to make money, and they're not doing it to gain businesses by booking someone from the US. Now, is that comprehensive?
obviously when you compare the foreigners and the locals, foreigners will obviously when they come in attract the crowd. It doesn't mean that it's effective. I think that the local solution is to find a way of, as I said, making what they're doing seem relevant and
In many cases, you find that people are not being altruistic. To portray something. That's why there will be a lot of fanfare about it. That's why there's a lot of cameras and all of that to say, oh, when it is the actual impact. 5 months down the line, 1 year down the line, has this thing actually had an impact? Or, if someone comes forward and does a 3 days, compared to actually training a local doctor, looking long term. In the short term, it's good. Yes, we're aware.
The important thing is get the key things across
the locals might even see it as something
absolutely
credit worthy about themselves, that we're able to attract companies.
Who said, the chief said, we don't want to corrupt Kenyan doctors and overcharge us for getting it for free. How could you argue with free? I do get
one has to look long term. They have to look long term. They're going to fall ill next year. To those people, are they guaranteed that we are responding to the response? Or is it better to have somebody on the ground that can actually prevent from falling ill next year? So again, it has to make the leadership policy exactly breaking these two things down. Why it is.
How we can take ownership of our agencies, our own communities.
You have to engage them. You should make them part of the solution. They are part of the solution, and my solution is better. And you're actively keeping them aware of what it is. It's not just a problem with them. How are you? But I come to the process of making it
see much of also because they too doing online. They don't have campuses as much. They have other offices, whereas I do go on campus
Next time.
Oh, really?
I will even send you an email.
Oh, well, no, that's fine. No, go say it.
It's the other place for me to be able to sit. No, it's the same thing. It's just for my future.
It's a bit much bigger.
Also, in terms of your introductory course, if there's any other things you'd like to add, say it.
Let me get
We're going to start just introduce you first. Well, I was worried that you might like it. Wonderful.
same thing. So, but actually, when I saw the compilation the other day, actually they're not too bad. They're quite good. I'm just trying to remember what it is. No, that's fine. I'm just trying to remember.
Yeah, the dinner shows all.
Oh, you're in there. There's academics, you have to write everything. Oh, I see. They stick to words.
Oh, thank you very much. You're welcome. Oh, what are you doing? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Absolutely. I've just got. But they have sort of outreach time. It's always and then of course they create It makes sense. Wow.
Sure.
Well, they've got money. They've got money.
Sarà su masculino.
Well, that's a good question. Yes, I met you. And I did too.
Hi, welcome to the ADF if you haven't been here yet today. I just got a short announcement. This panel finishes at 4:50 and then after that we're moving into the keynote. Yeah, so I'll pass over to Harold to start this.
Right, thank you very much. I'm Harold Huber. I lecture global energy and climate policy here at SOAS, the Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy. I'm very happy to be able to chair this panel and to welcome you all. And thank you, of course, also to the organisers for the Active Development Forum. Before I start to introduce our four panelists, just a few brief remarks from me. Obviously, we'll hear that from the speakers too, I'm sure. Climate change is one of those wicked international problems, one that is extraordinarily complex, where there's a huge number of integrated moving parts that need to be aligned, where there's a large number of stakeholders, countries in the international system, and of course, where there's a problem with getting our policies right, getting policies and strategies and planning in the first place, and sometimes the ones we do have are inadequate and are not really achieving the outcomes and solutions we're looking for. And of course, the problems are primarily, in a large way, concentrated in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. Why is that? Africa has contributed very little to the problem of global climate change, anthropogenic climate change, and yet it is said to face some of the worst consequences in terms of the impacts on the ground, changes to precipitation patterns, droughts, etc. And the problem in Africa is exacerbated by the fact that there's very little adaptive capacity. So the financial ability, the ability to have institutions in place, to have the know-how in place on the ground. There are a lot of efforts across the continent, but there's perhaps not enough that is being done. But we'll hear more from our speakers as to what the options and the ways forward are. And also, I would argue, as we move deeper into the 21st century, there's a very big challenge in the sense that Africa is set to grow and develop much faster as the next years and decades progress. Nigeria, as many of you know, is projected to be the largest country by population towards the end of the 21st century. A lot of these African countries have very ambitious growth and development plans, and of course ambitious plans also to address issues around energy poverty, energy access, and bringing everyone into the fold. And the challenge is moving forward in a low-carbon way and addressing the climate implications of economic growth, or doing it in a dirtier, more fossil fuel-driven way. So, for both of these dimensions, there is a lot still to do and a lot still to understand, and I'm very happy to have four experts on these and other issues here today who will be making remarks of about 5 minutes each, after which we'll start the conversation with a few questions from me, and then, of course, opening it up to the wider audience. And I'll just introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking and delivering their remarks. And actually, they're already sitting in the right order too, which is wonderful. So Chukwumerije Okereke is professor at the University of Reading. He works on low-carbon development, climate governance, the green economy, and business and industrial policy in Africa, including, very importantly so, including ethical dimensions and the role of equity and justice in international environmental agreements. He was also a lead author of the IPCC's 5th assessment report. Our second speaker is Yacob Mulugetta. He's Professor of Energy and Development Policy at University College London, so right next door. Before that, he was, he had a number of different roles, but amongst them he was with the UN Economic Commission for Africa in Addis, and he was coordinating lead author of the chapter on energy systems of the IPCC's 5th assessment report. His main focus is on infrastructure provision and human welfare, especially clean energy services. And then we've got Andrew Scott, the Overseas Development Institute, whose main research interests are energy access for poverty reduction and the role of energy in sustainable livelihoods and in the transition to low-carbon development pathways. And Andrew has researched and written extensively on Africa, but also on China, and more recently, from what I could see, online anyways, on the implications of Brexit on climate policy, amongst other topics. And finally, last but not least, Nana Cuello at the Institute of Development Studies, who focuses her work on inclusive green growth, particularly in the promotion of investments in clean energy that maximize poverty impacts. She's currently working on research projects dealing with pro-poor access to electricity, poverty impacts of mini-grids in Africa, and the political economy of climate-compatible development. So a panel of experts specifically on these issues. Very happy to have you all here. And I would hand it over to Chucks to give his opening remarks, about 5 minutes. What we'll do is that I've asked some very capable help up front to be showing you about towards the end of the 5 minutes when you've got a minute left. So you'll get an indication and then sort of slowly bring it to an end. You can stand up here if you want to, or just from where you're sitting.
I'm happy to be seated.
Wonderful. Okay, so okay, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Harold. It's a pleasure being here. As Harold was saying, climate change is clearly one of the greatest developmental challenges facing the world today, and particularly Africa. And there are two key reasons why Africa needs to pay close attention to this problem. Number one is, obviously, it has huge cost implications. Sea level rises, famine, desertification, drought. Already we have a lot of drought issues, climate change related drought issues in Africa at the moment as we speak. So there are huge human and development implications of climate change. But there's also the second reason, which is that climate change raises the cost of development. As some analysis suggests that it raises the cost of national budgets by up to 500% if you really want to integrate green considerations into national development plan. For example, the roads that you construct, the cost of electricity, new infrastructure. We know that the cost of some parts of, for example, solar panel is coming down, but nevertheless, overall, doing green growth takes a lot of upfront cost. But there's also the third dimension, which people don't often talk about, which is that it is entirely possible to have a global green growth transformation that still leaves Africa behind, which means that Africa would then continue to import green technologies from abroad, from the West, broadly speaking. Now, there is also the fact that if Africa allows the rest of the globe community to achieve green growth without making effort at this stage, then it is going to have huge implications for African development, because Africa has traditionally exported resources, primary resources. And we already see, for example, in Nigeria, that the fact that we have wind development, renewable energy development in China, fracking in US have actually cost Nigeria quite dearly in terms of the reduction of oil sales. Now, some people talk about climate change as it's a technical problem. Some people talk about it as it's a market issue. So they try and say, let's design some emission trading regime. Some people think it's a technological problem, so they will emphasize kind of geoengineering solutions. But some of us firmly believe that climate change is first and foremost an ethical challenge. There are various ethical dimensions of climate change, around greed, around consumption, around value, but it's also essentially about justice. And the justice implication of climate change rests in three asymmetries. Number one, asymmetry in contribution. The fact that the people, the cost of climate, the culpability, the contribution to climate change is not distributed equitably among nations. The second is asymmetry in impact, which is the fact that also the impact of climate change is not equitably distributed, and particularly that those who have contributed the least are going to bear the brunt of it. So essentially, in ethical terms, climate change really invites, or really is about the rich imposing the risks on the poor, and this is unacceptable. And then there's a third asymmetry, which is asymmetry in our ability to decide, which is the fact that those who actually are going to feel the impact of climate change and who have contributed the least are also the people that do not have effective voice around the decision-making table where solutions about climate change are being decided. This therefore raises a distinctive possibility that policies can be designed that further imposes risks on the poor or at least fails to take into adequate considerations their interests. And so what must Africa do? Well, 4 things. Number one, there has to be an ownership, an understanding of the problem, followed on through with the design of national low-carbon strategies. You cannot allow this thing to just fall upon your last as cherries. Leaders have to design bold and ambitious strategies. And we now already have good examples in Africa, like in Rwanda and Ethiopia, both of which have ambitious low-carbon strategies. Now, all of those have to be varied depending on the comparative interest advantage of the countries in question. But there are a number of commonalities that I would like to see in those strategies. Number one, they have to be heavy on local innovation because of the problem I already told you, that if we don't invest locally in terms of innovation, then it is entirely possible that we have other countries manufacturing the green technologies in Africa will be important. Secondly, there has to be involvement of the large population. It has to be inclusive. It has to be participatory. We cannot accept just 3 or 4 group of elites designing these national strategies without the inclusion of the broader public, because that raises a distinctive possibility also that we can have designs or national strategies that actually don't embody or inculcate or accommodate the broad varieties of values and that most of these quite heterogeneous African countries embody. And thirdly, it has to stress diversification of resources. We have to move away from just one source of resources. In Nigeria, oil; in Ethiopia, it could be resources, and seek to diversify our economic base. And then the last is that it has to be homegrown. It has to be owned by African countries. And I also think that going forward, Africa has to be also far more strategic in demanding justice from the international community. 80% of 80% of global resources are being used by 20% of global population. Whether you're talking about gold, about platinum, about oil, about timber resources, about chemicals, and Africa needs to begin to demand a compensation and strategic justice. So far, we have not been very effective in doing that. We've stayed at the margin, but we need for that narrative to change. Africa does not demand or need aid. Africa needs justice. Thank you very much.
And over to Yacob Mulugetta. Thank you.
I'll stand just for variety reasons. Well, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here amongst some of the most committed and active thinking, young scholars, academics, and so forth. It's a pleasure to be here. There were a couple of points that Chuck has managed to really scavenge, a lot of the territory that I wanted to touch on, but I will try to skid around, the areas that perhaps would bring some of his points, but also, add a few of mine. The first issue is when we are talking about low carbon development or low carbon transition, the concept, which is quite new to the whole development space, as well as the conversation around poverty reduction and so forth. It's quite important to really understand, what are the red lines that we are talking about, and I think that's something that very little discussion is happening. And here I'm really talking about the non-negotiables. The non-negotiables in the sense of what is it that here, we have abject poverty, serious deforestation, serious, land degradation, and so forth. So I think, there are certain things, that are very much, rooted to the whole development discussion that need to be laid to the ground. So in a sense, these are areas that countries have to defend. For example, I have a few lists here, that clinics and schools having access to electricity, targeted phase out of the number of women having to be burdened by wood fuel collection, increased energy content in agriculture, universal access of electricity in homes, etc. So each country needs to really lay out, what are its red lines beyond which, it cannot negotiate. It's only when we have something like this that the whole question around low carbon development makes sense. It needs to be rooted into the day-to-day country objectives and realities. So the second point is taking a low carbon pathway, as Chuck's highlighted, is not easy. When I was working at the UN Economic Commission, when we were trying to discuss questions around climate change, when you're talking about adaptation, there is no problem. That's a fairly understood notion. But when you start talking about making certain requirements and setting some criteria about the development pathway, that's a real ask for country policymakers. And low carbon development really does bring a whole set of competing demands, and it is quite challenging to sell to the policymaker. We found that out. The reluctance, of course, is understandable, given that the region's contribution to historic greenhouse gas emissions is quite small. And so why should countries even consider the whole notion of low carbon development? So it was a real difficult conversation to hold with country policymakers, to ask them to go that extra length and add another criteria to their development questions. But there are a number of things a number of points that we could raise here in terms of supporting or making the case for low carbon development. One is that, of course, the continent is richly endowed with green and renewable energy sources. So that in itself is pretty good enough, a compelling reason. You can't talk about structural economic transformation without massive increases in electricity generation and transmission. And what better way to do it than having to use the resources that you have at your disposal? So it makes sense, from a practical point of view. The second aspect is investment in clean energy has grown rapidly in recent years. We've seen that considerable investment is taking place to the point where fossil fuels have been overtaken by renewable energy investment. So here is a question: should Africa not be part of this technological transformation that we are seeing across the world? I would argue it should be part of that conversation. So Africa needs to engage, like it or not, in this world of innovation and creativity. And so the questions and issues around structural transformation have to really look at these opportunities. A lot of what Chuck's talked about so far, very eloquently, was the challenges associated with climate adaptation, climate resilience, and so forth. But there's also an opportunity that countries could be engaged in. So the third point I wanted to make was the how issue. And I think this is an open question. Chuck's talked about leadership as being very important. I would say 4 points on this. The first is this question around vision that we've seen. Certainly a handful of countries have managed to lay out what their real vision is in terms of aligning development and climate change. Yes, examples of Rwanda and Ethiopia. But I think we need to go beyond the continent, to try and look at good examples as well. For instance, you have examples in Uruguay, which has managed to increase its renewable energy share within its energy system quite significantly in the past 5 to 7 years. You have Vietnam, which has not necessarily gone the green route, but nonetheless and I think Andrew has quite a lot of experience on this, has managed to close the energy access gap from where it was around 10 or 15% in the 1990s to universal access what it is today. In a matter of 20 years, it's made significant progress. You have a country like Costa Rica, which doesn't have a military. So in a sense, countries need to have certain visions, that allow them to lay some of the ground rules. Unfortunately, I have to say, the elite in Africa needs to be invested in development, and this is something that we haven't seen, and we continue to face this challenges. And some of you may have heard of this book that came out recently, Development Divergences, comparing the Asian and the African experience, arguing that there is a question of intent, that the African elite, to an extent, has got a very strong predatory behavior compared to the Asian one, which is much more of a interest in integrated into poverty reduction. The second point on this how question is institutions. We're not talking just about organizations, but also norms, laws that need to be worked and brought into alignment with the whole low carbon pathway. The third area is finance, which is a critical enabler, and it's an area which seems to create quite challenging conditions. Partly because if you're talking about closing the gap of 70% non-access of electrification across Africa, as an example, how do you do that? How do you achieve that? In Asia, for instance, you have a much easier route in the sense that the populations are densely organized, and therefore you can actually talk about providing the grid across the board. You cannot do that in an African setting where populations are distributed very thinly, and therefore that's the models that we've used for electrification simply does not work in the context of Africa. The final point is this issue around short-term needs and long-term plans. So we are in a contradiction at the moment that country policymakers are faced with. The contradiction between the short-term nature of the challenge, the depth of the challenge in terms of poverty reduction and development needs, and the need for energy, scaling out energy and so forth. But at the same time, this is in conflict with the long-term needs for real planning that takes time, reflection, studies, etc. So there is a real kind of disconnect here between what's needed at the short term, but also how do you make sure that it addresses long-term challenges. And I think this time scale question is one that really is quite important, and I think worth discussing further. Thanks.
Andrew Scott. Thank you. I'll pursue the theme of diversity and stay seated this time and save myself climbing over everybody. Thank you to the organisers for allowing the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon. So it's a pleasure to do so. We've heard already that climate change presents some huge challenges, not just for Africa, but for the whole world. And those challenges are quite diverse. And when you get into climate change, there's a huge number of issues you can focus on. Even when we focus on climate change and energy, there's a wide variety of issues. So this afternoon, I'm just going to focus on the relationship between delivering universal access to modern energy services in sub-Saharan Africa and its links with climate change. But let me start though first by referring a little bit to the simple fact that within the international negotiations on climate change, the position of Africa has been one of development first. In all the negotiations in the Africa Group, within the UNFCCC negotiations, the message that they are delivering is that we want development first, and climate change, and particularly mitigation of emissions, is a secondary consideration to our development objectives. That's been a repeated theme of the Africa Group, Africa Union ministers' statements, and so on. part of that development first agenda is that energy consumption in Africa has to increase. At the moment, per capita energy consumption in Africa is about a third of the world average, which means it's vastly lower than the high energy consuming countries like Australia and the USA. And per capita consumption of electricity in sub-Saharan Africa has stayed almost static for the last 10 years. That's partly a question of the investment in the infrastructure and partly a question of population growth. But if Africa is to develop and the development agenda is pursued, per capita energy consumption will have to increase. And the question is how is that going to be done? And we've already heard about the challenge of the low carbon path. But to return, for the policymakers, delivering that increased energy supply to meet the growing demand, the emissions from that energy will be a secondary consideration to the security and expansion of energy supply. Now, when it comes to the challenge that sub-Saharan Africa faces of meeting the energy needs of the people who currently do not have access to modern energy services, and we're talking about 620 million people, 620 million Africans who do not currently have access to electricity in their homes. And we're talking about 730 million Africans who are dependent on unsafe solid fuels for their cooking energy. Addressing the energy needs of those people is part of the development agenda. At least it should be. And on paper, in many places, it is. But on paper, in many African countries, it isn't really there. The climate change implications of delivering universal access to modern energy services are actually negligible. If we're going to supply all the people in sub-Saharan Africa with modern electricity services from whatever sources, the net increase in greenhouse gas emissions is about 1%. It's the energy consumption of the middle classes and the urban people who are going to cause the increases in energy emissions in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not the people who currently don't have access. When it comes to cooking in particular, well, first of all, we can also distinguish a little bit between the provision of access to electricity through grid mechanisms and the provision of access to electricity through off-grid mechanisms, mini-grids or household systems. For off-grid systems, it's almost entirely going to be renewable energy. The opportunities that the low cost of particularly solar and wind present now means that it's affordable for most households, given the right financing mechanisms, to be able to afford the basic of lighting and phone charging and so on that they want and they need. For on-grid systems, it's back to the question of how do you increase the generation, but increasing generation, whether it's through utility scale photovoltaic systems or utility scale coal plants, doesn't necessarily mean that access is going to be increased. It's the investment in the transmission and distribution infrastructure that matters, not so much the investment in the generation. Most of the energy that's consumed in most sub-Saharan African countries is for cooking. It's a domestic energy supply. It's an energy supply that's off the policy agenda in most African countries. Fuel wood for cooking causes greenhouse gas emissions, and recent research suggests that those emissions have been underestimated in the past because of the way they've been calculated. Use of traditional wood fuel also causes an enormous number of deaths through air pollution and accidents every year. And as Yacob, I think, alluded to, the the labour that's required to collect that fuel wood, particularly for women and girls, is an enormous opportunity cost in the things that they could do with their time, such as going to school or earning an income. There are multiple benefits if Africa actually addressed the wood fuel energy problem. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's off the agenda, off the policy agenda of most African countries. And so I just wanted to conclude by saying that although there are things that could be done, the energy policy environment in many African countries doesn't address many of the issues that are to do with delivering universal access to modern energy services, whether it's climate change related or not.
And last but not least, Anna.
Okay. I think I'm forced to stand up.
Oh, please, yeah. Feel free.
To keep the pattern.
Keep the pattern, absolutely. Sorry, I need a pass.
So, yeah, hello, I'm Ana Puello, as he said. Being the last, many of the things I wanted to say have been said, but I hope I can bring something new. So I will tell you up front my 4 key messages in case the chair has to stop me for poor time management, so that they stay there. So the first key message is that the greenhouse gas emissions that Africa needs to catch up with higher income countries are not irrelevant, as it often is said that, oh, we didn't do anything, just let us grow in whatever way that is cheaper. So that's the first key message, that their emissions that they need to catch up are quite significant. Renewable energy is key for making poverty eradication goals compatible with climate stability. But renewable energy, the third message is that renewable energy will only experience mass deployment if it provides energy cheaper than fossil fuels. This is happening already in many countries, but these countries where renewables are becoming cheaper and competitive with fossil fuels have a lot of conditions that are not there in many African countries. So this is all I want to say, and let me just go on with it. So first, let's look at the profile of greenhouse gas emissions in Africa. We often hear, as we have been hearing now, that, and we hear from African leaders all the time, that their emissions are insignificant and they are not responsible for climate change, which is of course true. We also hear that the bigger impediment to Africa's growth is energy, and they should be allowed to develop in the cheaper resources that they have, which they say, it's often said, and it's often the case, it's very often fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas, and also large hydro. This message is true. So Africa's carbon footprint is very small. So Africa emits only 2% of the global CO2, and it has 18% of the global population. Also, as Andrew was saying, delivering universal access to electricity will have an insignificant impact on global emissions. However, taking this view of the significance of African emissions means taking a static view of Africa in the climate change and development debate. It kind of means assuming that Africa will remain poor. But if you look at the forecasts of emissions, just to give you an idea, emissions from LDCs, which are mostly African countries, are expected to triple between now and 2050. And the level they get by 2050 would be like half of the global carbon budget that we can emit to be able to keep climate stability. So it's actually very significant. Not only the quantity of emissions will increase as Africa develops, also the profile of emissions, or the way they are distributed, will change dramatically. So at the moment, energy is also a very small part of African emissions. Land use and agriculture are the biggest share of around 80% of emissions in Africa. Energy use is 70%, causes 70% of emissions globally, but in Africa, it emits only around 15% of these emissions. This is supposed to change dramatically in the future. not only the total energy emissions will change, also the way they are distributed among different fuels. Andrew was saying as well that biomass at the moment, mainly charcoal and fuel wood for cooking, are the dominant energy source in Africa. They account for more than 60% of total energy. On the contrary, electricity only emits 77% of greenhouse gas emissions in Africa, or only 4% if you exclude South Africa from sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a very, very tiny share. Fossil fuels, mainly for transport, complete the mix with around 20% of the emissions, 30%. If you compare this profile to the UK, for example, it's totally different. In the UK, electricity accounts for around 18% of emissions. Oil, petroleum products for transport around 47%, and natural gas, mainly for buildings and other uses, nearly 30%. So you can see this is what Africa would be developing towards. So what does the future hold for African greenhouse gas emissions as they develop? As African countries close their infrastructure gap, they will build more roads, transport emissions will increase dramatically, and there is not a really readily available cheap alternative to oil for transport. Also, the importance of electricity in the energy mix will grow as as the income of poor households increase. They will connect to the grid or use off-grid alternatives. They will also buy electric appliances. And this will happen, energy use will increase more rapidly for households coming out of poverty than for the middle classes. Also, we will see an increasingly services-based economy and the digitalization of the economy that we are already seeing. So the problem will not be, as we often hear, what will happen if every African household gets a refrigerator? Now the problem is also what will happen if every African household gets a smartphone or two? Because I don't know if you know, but smartphones, they use as much energy as fridges, as refrigerators. I just learned this yesterday and I was very surprised. So yeah, they look very small, but they consume a lot of energy. So what will happen if every household in Africa gets smartphones? As you know that mobile phones have spread very rapidly in Africa. Also another trend that is very much talked about today, many foresee that the change of paradigm towards the fourth industrial revolution that will be based on the digitalization of the economy, so cloud computing, the Internet of Things. Many see this as Africa's chance to leapfrog, so they say this will be the next big leapfrogging success story, it could be. So this would give Africa the hope of bypassing okay, I'm drawing to a close and I only said the first point, but it will allow Africa to bypass an industrialization model based on manufacture, which is very encouraging as they are finding it difficult to catch up with the Asian economies. So, let me go quickly to what I wanted to say. Renewables play a really important role in making the growth of electricity consumption compatible with climate stabilization. Energy efficiency is also very important, but in the past we have seen that the growth of an income per capita and population growth have made emissions increase faster than energy efficiency could cope with. So at the moment, we see two views in Africa. On one side, we see that Africa has vast renewable energy resources. This is also often repeated. But we also hear the African leaders saying that they are very expensive. There is a perception that renewables are expensive, so they are not utilized as much as they could. But on the other hand, we often hear in the news that renewables are becoming competitive with fossil fuels in many markets. For example, in 2015, renewables added more capacity than fossil fuels. And also for the first time, developing countries invested more in renewables than developed countries. So we see a trend there. Why is Africa not following that trend? And is it just the perception that renewables are expensive, just a perception, or is it real in Africa? And the answer that to some extent it is real. Like renewables are really very expensive in Africa in some cases because African countries don't meet many of the conditions that can make renewables cheap, which are the availability of patient capital, like long-term finance that is also low cost, like the finance that can be provided by pension funds or development banks. In Africa, we don't see either a large demand that can allow for economies of scale, as we have seen in China or other countries, and this is also because the energy markets are very fragmented, so regional integration could help with that. Also, something that Africa is lacking, and that is key for renewables, that need a stable revenue stream for a long period of time after a big upfront investment. We don't see stable and predictable policies that can be credible in the long term, and we don't see either a stable macroeconomic environment. So I'm nearly finishing, but I don't want to be too pessimistic. So I just want to highlight some of the very positive things that are happening in Africa and that show that there is hope for very disruptive good things to happen. Just to highlight some of them, for example, the very fast dissemination of off-grid solar systems in East Africa. They show that there is an option to leapfrog and to go to distributed renewable energy in rural areas. And also we see very successful experiences, for example, in the development of geothermal technology in Kenya, or also with the successful South African renewable energy auctions that have achieved very low-cost renewables as well. So this is the final remark, that Africa needs to solve a few things, as I said, finance, stability, and regional collaboration, but there are also very positive examples to learn from.
Thank you. Right, so thank you very much to all the panelists for the introductory remarks. We have about half an hour, just under half an hour, to get to questions, and because time is tight, I'm sure there's quite a few of you wishing to ask questions. I'll only abuse my chair's privilege for one question, and then we'll open it up to the floor. So as they're answering, think of the things that you'd like to ask in the coming rounds. So the one thing that, well, out of the many questions that one could ask, I didn't hear, and forgive me if you mentioned it and I just didn't catch it, but I didn't hear any of you mentioning the Paris Agreement on climate change. And I'm keen to hear what your thoughts are with regards to Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, and views of the Paris Agreement and the implications of the Paris Agreement. Now, we have this argument that, you know, it can provide certainty, it can provide countries with a framework. Of course, it's all about voluntary, nationally determined contributions and what the parties to the agreement are willing to put forward. But what are the implications, if any, from perhaps a positive angle or negative angle, as you see it, from the Paris Agreement on climate change? Chucks, would you like to start?
I said something around that, but I didn't quite use Paris Agreement.
I know.
But that's a very useful question. I have written a full paper on the implication of Paris Agreement,
which you
justice,
will
which
distribute.
I distribute. But to boil it down, the answer is it is mixed. The positive thing is that there is a commitment to 2 degrees centigrade, and an aspirational target of even 1.5. Africa pushed quite hard to ensure that 1.5 is mentioned, because from an African perspective, there is a need for ambitious global action on climate change. So that is positive. However, as you will know, as you just said, we're now moving to a bottom-up arrangement, and this has both positive and negative implications, particularly from the aspect of justice and equity, because it just does mean now that all the countries will now have to decide what they consider to be fair, okay? And just tell people, you know, these are the reasons why I think that my contribution is fair. We do not have any assurance that, in fact, as you know, there is a major, about 40 gigaton gap in terms of the absolute commitments that have been made. And there is no guarantee that those commitments are going to be met in any case. The Paris Agreement, in my view, de-emphasizes the issue of common but differential responsibility, which is a big problem. So that's why I was saying Africa needs to be far more strategic in the push for international climate equity and justice. It may well be that the final judgment about what Paris means for Africa will have to wait to see how it's actually implemented. Because capacity is a major issue, finance is a major issue. Since Paris, up until now, there hasn't been any significant movement in terms of addressing the financial problems or the capacity problems. Africa has just managed significantly to increase its take from the Green Climate Fund, which is a good thing. But as I indicated in my opening remark, some of the analysis show that we have up to 500% increase in if you really want to take climate change seriously and do green growth in Africa. And we just haven't got enough money. And there is also the capacity issue because there's some money in the pool that most Africans cannot access. So there's a problem of access and there's a problem of availability of funding. So I think there's a lot more I can say, but I don't want to monopolize.
I'm sure that some of the others on the panel feel strongly about this issue as well. Would you like to?
Just to add to what Chuck's said. One thing we could argue is on the positive side, where every country has been asked to deliver its INDCs. These are it's a complicated thing to unpack, isn't it? Nationally determined contributions. I can't remember what the I was for. Intended, yeah. Which basically demanded every country to submit its wish list, in other words. I think one thing that this has done is to look at the kind of the scale and the level of ambition and willingness to engage with this question. And from an African perspective, it could be beneficial, it could be helpful in trying to understand what each country is willing to do and able to do. Another positive aspect of this, depending on what people think, is that it has been the Paris Agreement has been useful in saving the multilateral system itself. Until that point, what we had was the failure of the Copenhagen Agreement in 2009. But at the very least, what it has done is that the UNFCCC is a bit stronger than it was in the past, although we don't know now, given that we have some crazy characters in running the White House and I don't want to say anything about this country because I live here. But on the negative side, to me, the Paris Agreement actually wasn't that positive. If one really wants to look at it, because we are actually heading towards a 3.5 to 4 degrees centigrade increase. Okay, we have it in the system that the INDCs will be reviewed every 5 years and so forth. But really, what we have on the table is a disastrous kind of pathway. And for Africa, that the African negotiators that continuously argue for a 1.5, that 1.5 is the red line. The 3.5 is absolutely devastating. So I don't know whether there is anything positive to write home about from an African point of view. One thing that was perhaps positive coming out of the Paris Agreement was there was an agreement to fund or to support renewable energy at a fairly large scale. This is called the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative, which was launched at in Paris, and to some extent, France put a lot of political capital behind it. Unfortunately, what's happening now is that the AREI is now in a bit of a limbo. What we had was a pledge in Paris. Now what we are getting is the usual stuff, which is pledges don't mean anything. They don't mean anything at all. So we had a pledge of a $10 billion US dollar investment in Africa on renewables, and those who have pledged, particularly the main countries such as France and the EU, are beginning to renege on those promises. So in a way, I think Paris has been, to my mind, not very successful at all from an African perspective.
If we can have some further briefer remarks, perhaps. Unfortunately, we've got to keep an eye on the time as well from Anna and Andrew. Would you like to?
Okay, I'll be really brief. So just to add a little bit of what they were saying. As you know, every country had to submit their NDCs as part of the Paris Agreement. So the African ones, some of them were really ambitious and really inspiring, like the Ethiopian one, for example, or I teach about them to my students in my lectures, so I have reviewed all of them. And but as you know, some of these NDCs are conditional. Like they say, we'll do all these beautiful things only if we get finance from richer countries. And this conditionality is the weakness, right? Because right now there is so much uncertainty on the finance. So all these beautiful exercises will turn to nothing under the uncertain environment of climate funding.
That's a strong enough point in and of itself, isn't it, Andrew?
Just two very quick points. One is that a lot of the detail of the Paris Agreement is yet to be agreed. So, for instance, the process for finalising the NDCs and the sort of peer reviewing of NDCs is yet to be decided. And I suspect that Job's points about CBDR will re-emerge in some of those discussions about what will be expected from least developed countries in particular in terms of the content of their NDCs. The second point, on NDCs themselves, like Anna, I've reviewed some of them, not all of them. And some NDCs promote and say they're going to increase investment in renewable energy and increase sometimes even the proportion of renewable energy. But the energy growth path of many countries also means that they can do that and at the same time increase net energy emissions. So not all countries are necessarily, even if they're promising to increase investment in renewable energy, they're not necessarily promising to reduce energy emissions.
Thank you for that not so positive take on the Paris Agreement, but as Andrew says, a lot of the details yet to be worked out. We'll take questions from the audience, and I suggest we'll take them and bundle them up in sets of 2 or 3 so that we can get through more questions faster and ideally keep it to a question so we can get to more people. So the gentleman at the back, then up front, and then over there the third question, the third row, as our first set of 3.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Going back to the initial part of this question, how is Africa transitioning to a low-carbon economy? The overwhelming consensus among the panel seems to be it's not. And what you've been focusing on the most is on policy, regulatory frameworks, and so on. And what I take from that is policy isn't helping the transition to a low-carbon economy. So in the absence of effective policy, what drivers do you see being effective to deliver a transition to a low-carbon economy and aiding development as well?
Thank you. Up front, please.
About a week ago in London, Commonwealth trade ministers met for the first time, and one of the issues that several highlighted, particularly from small states, was in the changing. About a week ago, Commonwealth trade ministers met for the first time in London, and one of the issues that particularly ministers from small states were highlighting was this changing moment of trade with Brexit and everything else going on. There is an opportunity and a need to bring in opportunities for around climate, whether it's around green technology, whether it's around climate financing, whether it's around diversification. So my question is, we need to perhaps think about entry points like those, not just to do more, but to accelerate and to broaden and to link into popular engagement on these issues. And none of you really picked up on the trade dynamics of that. I just wanted to ask about that.
Thank you. And the lady there on the third row.
So regarding the justice topic, every time we always think about Africa as one reality, and we speak about the relationship between the international community and Africa in general. So I was wondering your opinion about justice within the continent. So, and what is the role of African institutions in promoting equal access to energy to every country? Because we always hear about Ethiopia, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, but there are many more. So I was wondering, what is the role of African institutions in promoting this kind of equity and justice? Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. So the three questions, if I can just summarize again. So one, in the absence of policy or effective policy, what are the drivers, what are the possibilities that can move us forward? The second one, on the need to make sure that some of the tech and finance opportunities are met, that things that can be accelerated through trade and some of the entry points for renewable opportunities and other technological opportunities. And the third, on justice within the continent and the role of African institutions to promote fair and equitable access to energy within an African context. Who would like to start us off on these points? Anna, would you like to start?
Okay, I will address the first question. So, with regards to policies, there's not a lack of policies in Africa. There are many policies. The problem is they are not implemented. So, lots of countries have feed-in tariffs or targets, renewable energy targets, but there is a problem with implementation, which is political. So, at the end of every problem, there is always a political dimension. But if you ask also about drivers of things that can happen without significant policy involvement, one of the successful cases that I was talking about was the diffusion of off-grid systems in East Africa. So many call this the diffusion of small solar home systems through private means, mostly private means, as a sign of the failure of the distribution of utility. So it's a way of population who has the means to buy something that is cheap enough for them, to bypass a utility that is not working well to provide electricity to them. So when there are opportunities, like when there are products in the market that are cheap enough, and also when the barrier of access to finance is addressed through like pay-as-you-go models, that can be a driver for renewables to be deployed without policy.
Chucks, would you like to pick another question or this one as well?
Well, I'll offer one-line answer to the truth. What are possible drivers other than policy? Well, one is, for example, micro-enterprise. You might hope that there can be some kind of endogenous meshing up from the top, which could, over time, amount to significant momentum change. But it's quite hard given the urgency of the problem. But that is one driver that has been talked about in the literature. Africa is quite good in innovation, but innovation has its limits. There's no overarching policy to actually garner those up. But it is sometimes hoped that maybe desperation can lead to revelation or necessity to invention. But how quite that will turn out remains to be seen. African trade is a major. I had it, but she cut me off, so you blame her. but I had it on my paper to talk about the importance of trade. Power pools, for example, is one major area where Africa can, really do quite a lot of business, and in so doing, lower partially the cost of renewable, as Anna was talking about. Justice within the countries, that's a major one, because sometimes, especially for India, for example, there was this joke that India is always kind of having the front runner of international justice in negotiation. But then when you come into India, you see massive inequality in terms of energy access. And that also tends in Africa. The hope for me, in terms of where you asked about institution, is the civil society to be able to, articulate and press for much more equality, distributive justice within. And so I'm interested in what Anna is doing. Yacob and I also are looking into it, are working together on a project called Inclusive Green Growth, where we actually taken ourselves to task to think more about how to achieve greater equality and the sort of institutions that may be required to help that happen. And that's why I hinted on the need for participation and inclusion in the design of these strategies.
Yacob, would you like to pick up on that?
Yeah, I'm just one thing, maybe I don't know, maybe a slight disagreement with my colleagues here. I think there is no way around it. In a sense, if you don't have effective policies, if you don't have stable policies, then there's no point no way of progressing, towards a low carbon pathway. So there's no shortcuts in that sense. And yes, of course, there are, we indicated a couple of examples. Chucks and I were in Ethiopia just this past week, and one of the things that we're sensing is that, in Ethiopia at a policy level, it's pretty strong. So in a sense, if you speak to the ministers and the department heads, what you're, getting is a very coherent, kind of vision. But also the specificities of the policies are fairly well understood at that level. The challenge you have is implementation. When you take it down to the level of operations and so forth, that's where the real challenge begins to show. So I think the policy direction has to be maintained, because without that you can't really, make much headway. But the things that actually allow the policy to flourish, that is institution building, capacity development, strengthening research and knowledge institutions and so forth, really has to happen in order for that top layer type of thinking, to take shape. On this question around trade dynamics, I do think that yes, it does offer opportunities, but at the same time, we're also in a slightly negative period at the moment, with the whole Brexit and not knowing exactly what is going to happen, what's coming from the US, for example. The US had a very interesting program called Power Africa and it was picking up a lot of investment, a lot of support for countries, and particularly and it was somewhat slanted, towards renewables. We don't know what will happen now. Power Africa might continue, but it might actually fund coal. Yeah. So we don't know. I think until things become clarified, we're not entirely sure.
I want to give Andrew a chance to get in, but just to let you know that we've got just under 10 minutes left, because afterwards there'll be the keynote. So, Andrew, and then after that we'll take 2 questions, I think, and hopefully we can answer them quickly. And then everything else you'll have to do in the time you have after the event. Andrew.
Okay, very quickly to give everybody time to ask questions. Two points. One is on the policy question. The language I would use would be governance. It's not a question of whether the policies exist or not. It's the whole governance culture. If you get the governance right, the political risks of investing in renewable energy go down because the financing costs go down. If you get that right, then you're great. The second point is the cost of renewable energy, with or without the political risks, are going to continue to go down. That presents enormous potential opportunities for African countries to invest in renewables and provide the energy that will enable growth to take place. The challenge for African countries is to switch their energy and power sector plans in particular towards renewables, which at the moment they're currently not really doing.
Fantastic. 2 quick questions that we can collect together. So we've got one up here in the 3rd row, and then down there on the side. Unfortunately, the others will have to hold on to their thoughts and talk to the panelists after. So down here, please, and then over on the 4th row over on the side. Apologies to everyone else, but please carry on.
Okay. So you have addressed the potential of renewables, especially off-grid solar solutions, for achieving energy access for rural households. But what about the industrialization imperative in context of this mitigation debate? So access for cheap energy is crucial for industrial development. Thank you.
Fantastic. And then the second question.
My question is directed, I think, to the second speaker. You touched on about how African countries can strike a balance between their short-term and long-term needs. So if you don't mind, if you could just quickly go back to that. Just talking about the politics of climate change, because essentially the discussions and agreements happen at a global and national level, but I think they've struggle to find expression or to be implemented locally because of the priorities, particularly because politicians are in office for a very short time and they need to show deliverables immediately in order to secure themselves for the next term of office. So how do you go about investing in long-term versus short-term goals?
Right, lovely. So the 2 points on the industrialization imperative and energy in regards to that, and the second on the short-term needs and long-term plans. So maybe you can start with that second point actually, because that speaks directly to the issue you raised.
Okay. I think that's a good question. The key is how do you build political consensus, regardless of what kind of political line you follow. And there are some interesting, really good examples. In Brazil, for instance, the whole question around participatory budgeting. There are some interesting examples where if you have a successful program, policy, there is always a tendency that those that follow might follow suit. But I think what I was meaning there was largely to do with the fact that, in a sense, the pressing challenge of let's say energy access and the stuff that, for instance, Andrew was talking about, which is this this urgency towards increasing consumption for energy. That's a fairly immediate challenge that we're faced with. But at the same time, what you do there, you have a choice. The choice you have is either you lock yourself in diesel generation or you move into something else, which may seem more futuristic in a sense, because if you're talking about renewable energy, quite a lot of the challenge there is the capital cost that you have to invest, and you don't have those recurrent costs that you might find in other systems. So in a way, the long-term thinking is more about the long-term element is more about you've identified the problem, and the pressing problem that you have will continue. The question is, how can you make your interventions become much time-proof in a sense? This is really what it's about. But the political challenge, you're right, it's always going to be there. The issue is how do you build consensus on the ground within politicians and policymakers in such a way that any new person that comes in will not have the legitimacy to be able to change things.
Andrew, would you like to pick up on that?
On the industrialization question, I think yes, Africa has to increase the productivity of the economies in order to generate the wealth to enable African populations to prosper. And there's a big argument out there in the academic world about whether or not there is actually an opportunity for Africa to industrialize, given the robots and all the rest of it. But the question a little bit is how are our countries going to improve the productivity? And there's a lot that could be done, particularly in the agro and agro-industrial sector, to enable to do that. And coming back to an earlier question about trade, particularly if that is orientated to regional trade rather than international trade, I think there's opportunities there. Yes, a lot of that could be done in a low-carbon way, both through sustainable agricultural type practices and even in the energy sector. But at the moment, Africa's utilities, by and large, are pretty well not up to the job. They're badly managed. They're dependent on subsidies and so on. So as well as investing in new infrastructure, generation and transmission and distribution infrastructure, the industrialization isn't going to happen unless the utilities are sorted out and made to be much more efficient.
Anna?
Okay, I'll be very brief. So with regards to the industrialization question, in my talk I was talking very much about the growth in demand not only due to households, but also to the industrialization opportunities that exist or with the change of paradigm, so that may allow Africa to leapfrog. And also, as you say, off-grid is not often associated with industrialization. It's more for access. I was doing some work in Kenya, and the government has access agenda and a growth agenda. And for growth, they look at large scale renewables, and for access, they look at off-grid. So it's very much like that. Off-grid is just an access thing. It's very cute. It looks nice, but they are, for their growth, they are interested like in this big wind farm in Turkana or something that sends a signal to the world that they are a prosperous country. So yes, and for that policies are key to develop those kinds of renewables.
In about the 1 minute we have left, the last word is for Chucks.
I would agree with you that industrialization is an imperative for Africa. Okay, I cannot see the future of Africa without enduring structural transformation, and that really requires some investment in industrial policy. I reject a romantic view of Africa that tends to equate development with some tokenistic, marginal, incremental, adaptive capacity building at the local level. But at the same time, this industrialization has to take into account the imperative of climate change. So green growth, therefore, is the future. Resource extraction-based growth is unsustainable, and fluctuating prices will consign Africa to uncertainty, and we must move away from that. And in terms of the point about investing now and future, let me end on a note of disagreement with Yacob so that we can have something to talk about on the train. For me, the problem is not so much about the trade-off between long-term and short-term. If you take Andrew's point, for example, that trade-off is not imperative in understanding why we cannot achieve universal access. It is more of the problem of governance and politics, as Anna was hinting to. So we need a strong and robust narrative. We need a clear vision. And I think that if we have a clear vision, we can see that there are many opportunities for win-win or low-win or low-hanging fruit, whichever way you want to call it, that actually secure the political future of these politicians while delivering the dividends of democracy. Thank you.
And your questions, and I thank the panel again for a wonderful session, and the keynote is next. But thank you so much again.
Thank you so much to the climate change panel. We're having a really quick changeover to the keynote, so if you're interested, please stay seated. So it'll start within the next 5 minutes. Thank you.